Now that we have our error enumeration completed and our modules created, we can start implementing the functionality on our modules. So if we expand the field folder on the left, we'll start with the content here. We're going to skip the clip ID and we'll do that one last. So we'll start with the content. Double click on that and we'll have our empty file loaded. Okay, in this file, we're going to want to include the error enumeration that we created. So we'll use super and we'll use clip error. Super will just access the one module up, which contains the error. We'll also want to use SERDI, and we're going to be using serialize and deserialize. We're going to be using these two lines for most of these modules, so you might want to copy and paste. We then want to create a new type. This type has already been named because we created it earlier, so we'll just fill it in. We named it content, and it's going to contain a string. We're also going to use some derive macros on here. We want clone, debug, serialize, and deserialize. All these fields are going to include serialize and deserialize because we need them to be converted to JSON for the API. We now want to implement some functionality, so we'll implement functionality for the content. We want a new function. The new function will take the content as a string, and it will attempt to create a content structure. Since I don't want the content to be blank, I'm going to return a result. So if the content is blank, then we'll get an error. So if it's okay, we'll get self, and otherwise we'll get a clip error. Within the function body, we'll see if the content is empty, and we'll also trim white space. And note that we're negating this result. So if the content has been trimmed of all spaces, is empty, and that's true, then we just want to invert that, and that'll mean that there is content. So we'll just return an OK, and we'll take the content and create an owned string out of it. And otherwise, we will be returning an error. So we'll return the clip error, and it'll be an empty content error. The reason that we're creating a new type for every single field in the structure is because, if you recall, Rust will not create a structure unless the data is valid. So we can create a content, and we can supply it a string, but we actually have to supply some kind of string. And since this string is private, notice that there's no public keyword here. That means the only way to create content is to go through this public function new here, which then validates that our string meets the requirements that we want. Taking that in combination with the public keyword here, we'll be able to publicly access this structure anywhere, which is the content. However, we'll only be able to access the inner content from within this implementation block. This results in the content structure always being valid, assuming we can make one. And since it's valid, and if we put it in our clip structure, then that field will be guaranteed to be validated. Applying this concept to every single field means that every single clip structure is automatically validated. As a bonus, we'll also be able to use this content field within other structures, such as forms and API communications, and we're guaranteed that if we get one back, that it is already valid. This reduces the need of trying to validate structures as a whole, like a clip structure or a form structure or an API call. They don't need to be validated individually because they're already validated field by field. We'll see how all this comes together later when we go to make our clip structure and we make API calls. I'll be creating two more functions for the structure. One is going to be named intoInner. That's going to take an owned self as a parameter. It's going to return a string, and we're just going to access the inner value of self. So this intoInner function is commonly used across the Rust ecosystem, and all we're doing is we're moving self, so the content won't exist anymore, and we're accessing the inner value, which is a string, and it's just going to get returned directly. So what this does is it just converts this content back into a string. We'll be using this functionality frequently across all of the fields when we need to convert the data into a format suitable for the database. I'm also going to make an asStir function, which just borrows self, and we're going to get a reference. So we'll just take self.0.asStir. And this will be useful for logging and transforming the data when we still want to keep a copy of the content around. Since we're just borrowing it, the content will still exist, and we'll just get a nice reference, so it'll be running quickly too. That'll do it for our content field. So let's go ahead and work on the next field. We're also going to be skipping expires, so clip ID and expires will be handled later. Next, we'll do the hits field, so double-click on hits.rs. For this field, we're going to need serialize and deserialize, so go ahead and use that from SERDI. And we're also going to be using the derive more crate. So we'll scroll down to our cargo.toml file and add that crate. For derive more, we're using version 0.99. So we'll have derive more, and that'll be 0.99. We're using that so we can easily create new functions. So if we use derive more, we're going to utilize the constructor macro. We'll then create our field. So it's a structure named hits, and that's just the number of hits that, or the number of times that the clip has been visited. It's going to be an unsigned 64-bit integer because we can't have any negative hits. And we're going to derive clone constructor. So constructor is part of the derive more crate, and that creates a public function new, which simply returns the structure with the inner value. We'll derive debug, deserialize, and serialize. For our implementation, we'll simply do an into inner, and that will consume self just like the other one, and we'll return self.0. Before continuing, I just want to show you the code that's generated by the constructor macro. It'll generate this public new function, which accepts some data, and it's a U64 because we have a U64 here. It just returns self and just wraps up that data. We'll be using this pattern a lot where we just have a new function that wraps up data. So we can use the constructor macro to just make this function for us. That way we don't need to write it every time. The hits field is straightforward and we don't need any additional functionality for it. We can close that and move on to the next.